The last thing he remembered. The last thing Daniel Mercer remembered was a voice telling him to think of somewhere peaceful. Not because anything had gone wrong, not because anyone sounded worried, but because that was simply what people said before anesthesia drew a curtain across the mind. Think of somewhere peaceful, a beach, a holiday, your bed at home, anything soft and harmless enough to fill the few seconds between consciousness and oblivion. He remembered the shape of the theatre lights above him. He remembered how cold the operating table felt beneath his back, even through the gown. He remembered the faint sting in the vein of his hand where the cannula sat taped in place. He remembered the smell too, something clean, dry and clinical, a mixture of warmed plastic, scrub soap and air conditioning. And then there were the voices. Steady, ordinary, practiced. Blood pressure's fine. Oxygen on, just a few deep breaths for me. He had asked a question. He would never remember exactly what it was, only that it had been small and human and embarrassed. Something about how long the operation would take. Something about whether he would feel sick afterwards. One of the anaesthetists had answered kindly. There had been that low, unhurried confidence that medical people used when they had done the same thing 1,000 times before. "We'll look after you." That was what she had said, and he had believed her. He remembered the mask lowering towards his face, transparent, soft rubber edge, a hand holding it in place. Another hand squeezing the bag, cool oxygen flooding his mouth and nose, then another voice. Sharp scratch already done, little bit of medicine going through now. There had been a strange heaviness in his arm, a coolness climbing from the back of his hand towards his elbow. Then the bright lights above him had stretched and blurred at the edges. His body had become something distant and overexposed, as if he were already no longer fully inside it. Someone had said his name. Daniel. And everything folded inward. He expected waking to feel like surfacing. That was how people described it, wasn't it? As if consciousness returned in layers, the sound first, then the light, then the self. Instead, it arrived all at once. A hard return, no softness, no gentle lifting. He was simply there, aware, trapped. At first, he did not understand what was wrong. There was darkness, but not complete darkness. Shapes existed somewhere beyond him. A low mechanical pulse cut through the stillness. He tried to gather himself, tried to work out whether his eyes were closed. Then he tried to open them. Nothing happened. He tried again, commanding muscles that did not answer. Open, blink, move. Nothing. A flicker of panic moved through him. He tried to breathe deeply and felt resistance, a pressure not of his own making. Air entered him in a rhythm that did not belong to him, as if someone else had taken over the simple act of staying alive. It came with a hiss, a pause, a release, again, again. Ventilator. The word struck him with such sudden force that panic became terror. He was intubated. He was not awake in recovery, groggy and safe, with someone at his side telling him it was all over. He was somewhere worse. He could hear now. More clearly, a curtain of muffled voices, rubber soles against polished flooring, monitor tones, the irregular alarm from a machine in the distance, metal against plastic, the sound of syringes being dropped into a tray, drawers opening and closing. He was in intensive care. Why? The question tore through him with such violence that he tried to move everything at once. Fingers, legs, jaw, chest, throat, and the effort produced absolutely nothing. No movement, no sound, not even the twitch of a fingertip against a bedsheet. He screamed inside his own skull. Outside, a monitor kept beeping with perfect indifference. He learned the shape of the ICU without ever seeing all of it. At first there were fragments, the sensation of bright light through closed lids or half-opened ones, or whatever state his eyes existed in now. The low wash of activity that never fully stopped, even in the quietest hours. The way voices carried differently depending on where they stood, close and detailed when at the bedside, hollow and indistinct when coming from the central desk. He realized, slowly, that he was not in a side room. He was in the open bay. He could hear too many lives unfolding around him. There was a man somewhere to his left, with wet breathing, and an older wife whose voice shook every time she spoke. There was a younger woman further away, not ventilated, who cried at night because she thought no one could hear her. There was an elderly patient who seemed to fill every shift handover with the same debate about escalation, renal function, and whether the family fully understood how sick he was. Beds separated by curtains and space and equipment. 6 of them, he thought at first. Then maybe 8. Hard to tell. Different monitors, different alarms, different patterns of urgency. He came to know the staff too, at least by voice. The consultant who spoke in low, clipped summaries during the morning ward round. The registrar who sounded tired even before midnight. The nurse with the Irish accent who hummed while checking infusion pumps. The healthcare assistant who always apologized softly before turning patients. The junior doctor whose uncertainty was obvious in every hesitant presentation. And then there was the nurse named Layla. He did not learn her name immediately. Only her tone. She spoke to patients, even the ventilated ones, as if they were still fully present inside of themselves. Morning. I'm just going to do your observations. I'm turning you onto your side now. Sorry, I know that's uncomfortable. Small things, meaningless to anyone else, enormous to him, because by then Daniel had realized something unbearable. Most people talked over him, around him, through him, but not to him. He was bed 6. He was post-op complication. He was poor neurological picture. He was not for extubation yet. He was a problem without a personality, an occupied space in the bay, a body held in suspension while people searched for a reason he had never woken. He pieced his story together from fragments others carelessly left within earshot. The operation itself had apparently been straightforward. That was one of the first things he understood, and somehow it made everything worse. No major blood loss. Procedure uncomplicated. No obvious intraoperative event. There had been no cardiac arrest. No massive hemorrhage, no catastrophic anesthetic error openly named at the bedside, no single dramatic moment a layman could point to and say, there, that was where life split in two, just a routine operation that had ended with a patient who did not wake. He heard discussions about delayed emergence, differential diagnoses, metabolic causes, imaging, EEG, sedation washout, drug effects, rare complications spoken about with that careful balance doctors used when they were uncertain but did not want uncertainty to sound like helplessness. Pupils reactive, brainstem reflexes present, CT unremarkable. Still no meaningful response. The phrase repeated over days. No meaningful response. Inside his head, Daniel built a private universe of rage around those 3 words. He was responding. He was screaming. He was there every second of every conversation. He knew when the morning light changed. He knew when the ward round entered the bay because the atmosphere tightened and every voice arranged itself into hierarchy. He knew which family members brought flowers and which brought guilt. He knew the exact sequence of sounds before a chest x-ray, before suctioning, before arterial. Blood gases were taken. He felt things too, not normally, not clearly, but enough. Pressure, pain stripped of all context. The raw horror of suction through the tube. The tugging of lines, the ache of immobility, the deep, dirty discomfort of a body becoming something he no longer controlled. At some point, a consultant said quietly, "We may need to have a more realistic conversation with the family." Daniel did not know whether his family cried. He only knew they came. His mother once stood near enough that he could hear her holding herself together by force. "I know you can hear me," she whispered. The words detonated inside him. Yes, yes, I can. I can hear everything. I'm here." But all the life in the world could not move a single muscle. Time inside the body was different from ordinary time. There were no clean transitions, no sense of morning earned by waking or night earned by sleep, just stretches of awareness punctuated by procedure, pain and sound. He tried at first to count the hours using the rhythms of the unit, the early morning bloods, the consultant round, the relatives, the reduction of lights in the evening, the deeper quiet after midnight. But it all bled together. Day by day, his sense of himself began to erode. Daniel Mercer had once contained details, a flat, a phone full of messages, favorite music, bills to pay, a relationship that had recently ended, badly enough that he had thrown himself into work to avoid thinking about it. A habit of leaving mugs by the sofa, a tendency to promise he would book holidays and never book them, all of that started to feel unreal. The body on the ICU bed became the whole geography of existence. He knew when his mouth was dry but could not ask for water. He knew when secretions pooled and made him want to retch but could not turn his head. He knew when someone cleaned him, repositioned him, checked his pressure areas, changed the sheets, assessed his pupils, listened to his chest, drew blood, charted numbers. And every indignity, every intimate reduction of a human being to tissue management and physiology happened while he remained fully conscious behind the silence. At first, the silence felt like imprisonment. Later, it became something colder, erasure. Because he could do nothing, he listened. It was the only power left to him. He learned the stories of the others in pieces, the way one learns neighbours through walls. Bed 2 was Mr. Holloway, 68, severe pneumonia, difficult to wean from the ventilator. His wife came every afternoon and spoke to him about ordinary things, the dog, the post, the tomatoes in the greenhouse, as if ordinary life might offer a rope back to the world. Bed 3 was a young motorcyclist with devastating injuries who seemed surrounded by noise whenever his family visited. So many voices, brothers, friends, a father trying not to sound broken. They told him they loved him every 5 minutes. They begged him to keep fighting. Staff came often, adjusted things, escalated things, discussed scans, examined pupils, responded whenever alarm sounded. Bed 4 was an older woman after abdominal surgery. She improved slowly. You could hear it in the tone of the staff around her, more hopeful, less guarded. Her daughter brought lotion and brushed her hair and laughed through tears when doctors said words like progressing and possible step down. Bed 5 deteriorated one night and was gone by morning. The bed sat empty for a few hours afterwards in a way Daniel found almost obscene. All that suffering wiped clean into vacancy, sheets stripped, machines reset, space made ready for whoever came next. Then a new patient arrived and absorbed the attention of half the bay. That was what disturbed him most, the continuity of the place. No matter what happened to any one person, the bay continued. Another admission, another handover, another crisis, another bowl of half-finished staff room cereal returned to between calls and alarms. He had once believed illness would make the world pause. It did not. The world narrowed, then moved on. The first time he altered anything, he did not know he was doing it. It happened during one of the worst nights. The bay was understaffed. He could tell from the tension in the voices, from the speed of footsteps, from the way the registrar's tone flattened into that dangerous calm people used when too many things were going wrong at once. Bed 3's blood pressure had dropped. Bed 2 was fighting the ventilator. Someone in the far corner was bleeding around a line. There were calls for blood gas syringes, for another pair of hands, for noradrenaline adjustments, for someone to bleep theatre recovery to ask whether they had capacity to help. And Daniel lay in the middle of it all, fully conscious, invisible again. At some point he heard Layla at his bedside. "Sorry, love. I'll be back. We're just a bit stretched." The kindness in her voice hurt more than cruelty would have. When she walked away, something inside him tipped. Not anger yet, not exactly. Something like a desperate, concentrated need to be noticed. A machine near him, not his own ventilator, another one, perhaps the pump at bed 4 or the monitor led near his shoulder, gave a small, odd chirp, just once. A flicker. The sort of sound equipment made all the time and staff learned to interpret subconsciously. But Daniel had been thinking with ferocious intensity about making something happen, make them look, make them come back. The alarm repeated. A nurse paused. What was that? Someone checked a connection, muttered that it was probably loose, silenced it, and moved on. Daniel felt an impossible jolt inside himself. Not in his limbs, somewhere stranger, a correspondence between thought and machine. He did not understand it, only knew that for 1 second the world outside had shifted because of him. And then, for the first time since he woke into the prison of his own body, hope returned. Hope survived exactly 2 nights, long enough for him to test the boundaries of what he had felt. He began with tiny things. The slight wobble of a waveform, a false desaturation that resolved as soon as someone checked the probe, a pump line alarm, a momentary spike on the screen that made a nurse glance over. He learned slowly, without language for it, that effort mattered, not physical effort, but concentration. Focus sharpened to a point. Rage and need seemed to strengthen it. When he drifted into exhaustion, nothing happened. When he fixed his whole awareness on a single sound, a single rhythm, a single blinking number, he could push against it. He could not affect everything. Not at first. Only machines close to him, machines wired into the immediate environment of the bay, devices already half alive with electricity and alarms and data. His own monitor was easiest, then the ventilator, then a pump. The first time he managed to interrupt the ventilator's cycle by a fraction of a second, he almost thought he had imagined it, but he heard the altered hiss, heard the machine compensate, heard the nurse come to check. Strange, she murmured. Strange. He had become strange, and somehow that was better than being nothing. For a time, his experiments were not cruel. They were frantic attempts at communication by someone reduced to pure trapped awareness. A flicker when someone asked a question at the bedside, a pause in rhythm when a hand rested on the sheets, a string of irregular beeps when his mother whispered that she was there. No one understood. Some noticed oddities. Most did not. One doctor said, "He's not responding in any purposeful way." Purposeful. If Daniel could have laughed, he might have. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked evening a week, maybe more, into his stay. He only knew it had been raining because visitors carried the smell of wet coats and cold air into the bay. His family had gone. The consultant had spoken to them somewhere away from the beds, but not far enough that Daniel missed the shape of the conversation. Unlikely to recover. Supportive management, if no meaningful change. Later, a junior doctor repeated the summary at the desk in the language medicine used to sand the edges off despair. Family informed, poor prognosis discussed. Poor prognosis discussed. His future flattened into 2 charted words. Around the same time, Bed 4's daughter arrived with photos from home. She laughed through tears while telling her mother about the cat refusing to eat from anyone else's hand. Staff smiled. Someone said, "She's done really well today." The whole space around that bed seemed warmer, brighter, more invested. In the neighboring bay, a patient was extubated to applause and relief. Daniel listened to every second of it, the cough, the reassurance, the congratulatory softness in staff voices. The phrase, "Well done, you're breathing on your own now." Breathing on your own. He would have given anything to feel that once more. And then, when the bay quietened, he heard two nurses discussing turns. "Let's do the active patients first," one said. "Bed 6 can wait 10 minutes. Bed 6 can wait." The words entered him like a blade. That was the moment something essential shifted. Not because the delay mattered medically, not because the nurses were cruel. They were exhausted, and he knew that. But because he understood with complete and annihilating clarity what he had become in their eyes. Not Daniel, not a man trapped in an impossible state, an inert problem, a body stable enough to postpone. He did not feel anger first. He felt humiliation, then envy, then hatred, bright, clean, and uncoiling. That night, Mr. Holloway, in bed 2, began to deteriorate just after 2 in the morning. Daniel had listened to his wife for days, had come to know the gentle rituals of her visits, the things she repeated as if routine itself might save him. The dog had refused to sleep on Mr. Holloway's side of the bed. The tomatoes were finally ripening. Their grandson had passed his driving test. Daniel knew all of this. And when the ventilator beside bed 2 faltered, not enough to fail outright, just enough to reduce delivered volume and delay recognition for precious seconds, Daniel knew exactly what he was doing. He told himself it was only a test. He told himself someone would notice immediately. He told himself, in some deep shattered corner of himself, that the point was not to kill, but to prove power. The man's oxygen saturation drifted down. An alarm sounded, not loud enough at first. A nurse silenced one alert while addressing another patient. The waveform worsened. Secretions, tube position, equipment issue. The usual checks began, but Daniel had learned how to make doubt bloom before certainty. By the time the registrar arrived, the whole bed space had changed temperature, urgency, more people, commands, the rush of intervention, and Daniel felt something sickeningly close to satisfaction, not because Mr. Holloway suffered, because attention had become movable, because life in the bay had bent around a crisis Daniel created. Because for the first time since waking into paralysis, he was no longer powerless. Mr. Holloway survived the night, but not unchanged. The next day, his wife cried harder than before. Daniel listened in silence and discovered that guilt, too, could fade if fed often enough by resentment. As he crossed that line, each step afterwards became easier, not morally, mechanically. He learned that the night shift was his ally. Fewer staff, dimmer light, longer stretches between direct observation, small anomalies more easily attributed to fatigue, secretions, artifact, coincidence. He learned that deterioration need not be dramatic to be effective. Tiny interferences compounded beautifully in critical care. A slightly delayed alarm, a transient occlusion. A number drifting just enough to distract from another number, a ventilator trigger made erratic, a pump that appeared to function, then faltered. He never attacked the same way twice. That was instinctive. Variation preserved ambiguity. Sometimes he targeted the patient whose family spoke most lovingly, sometimes the one whose improvement drew praise. Once, when Layla spent nearly an hour at bed 3, after a difficult procedure, Daniel made bed 4's monitor cascade into false arrhythmia, just to pull her away. She came, of course. They always came when the machines demanded it. That truth became his gospel. People ignored suffering all the time, but they obeyed alarms. And because of that, the equipment that surrounded the bay ceased to be equipment in his mind. It became an extension of intention, a nervous system he could infiltrate one blinking light at a time. The patients worsened, not enough at first to trigger suspicion beyond general ICU bad luck. These patients are all fragile. Could just be a run of difficult nights. Check the machine. Swap the pump. Recite the line. One consultant wondered aloud whether a batch of tubing was faulty. Another blamed delirium in an awake patient for repeatedly dislodging monitoring. A nurse joked darkly that the bay was cursed. Daniel heard that and almost smiled inside his own silence. Layla remained the one person he could not fully hate, which was unfortunate for her. She had been kind from the beginning. He knew the cadence of her footsteps before she reached his bed space. Knew the way she adjusted blankets without fuss, knew that even on the busiest nights she still told him what she was doing. "Morning, Daniel. I'm cleaning your eyes. I'm just suctioning." "Sorry. I know." "You're not alone, all right?" That last one nearly destroyed him, because he was alone, utterly, and hearing someone deny it with tenderness only sharpened the truth. Layla started to notice the pattern before anyone else, though at first she only noticed its emotional residue. The bay felt wrong on the night she looked after Daniel, not haunted, not in any childish sense, just wrong. Patients who had been stable all day would dip after midnight. Pumps alarmed, strangely. Ventilator parameters shifted without obvious reason. Numbers corrected themselves before anyone could capture a clear explanation. It was enough to make experienced staff uneasy, but not enough to withstand daylight scrutiny. During one handover, she said, half apologetically, "I know this sounds odd, but most of it seems to start around bed 6. The registrar, exhausted and balancing too many immediate problems, said what tired registrars often say. "It's probably just because he's central in the bay and everyone notices his alarms first." A reasonable answer, an entirely wrong answer. A few nights later, she stood beside Daniel while the rest of the bay briefly settled. The only sounds were the ventilator, the monitor, and the soft electrical chatter of machines in standby. "You've had a horrible run, haven't you?" she said quietly. Daniel concentrated on the monitor until his entire awareness felt like a blade. The heart rate flickered. Layla frowned. She checked the leads. Fine. She looked at the screen again. Daniel pushed harder. Beep. Pause. Beep, beep. Not normal. Not random. Her breathing changed. "Daniel!" Every atom of him surged toward the machine. The oxygen saturation trace shivered. Layla did not move. The unit around them seemed to hold its breath, and in that impossible, awful stillness, she understood the first part of the truth. Someone was still in there. To suspect is one thing, to know is another. The next night, Layla returned with the private, rational determination of someone trying very hard not to be ridiculous. She waited until the bay was quiet, waited until the central desk was busy with another admission and the dimmed lights cast everyone into a kind of late-night half-reality. Then she came to Daniel's bedside and spoke low enough that no one else could hear. "If you can understand me, I need you to do something clear." Daniel gathered himself. Every moment of isolation, every helpless day, every swallowed scream, every instance of being turned, cleaned, suctioned, discussed, delayed, deprioritized, he condensed all of it into pure intent. Layla looked at his monitor. Once for yes. The arterial line trace spiked, then settled. Her hand flew to her mouth. No machine did that by accident in response to a sentence. She stared at him, tried to think of explanations, and watched them collapse one by one. "All right," she whispered. again. If this is really you, once for yes. The ventilator gave a brief, asynchronous stutter. Not enough to trigger an alarm. Enough. Layla stepped back so abruptly that she hit the infusion pole. Metal clinked. She looked around, almost expecting someone else to have witnessed the impossible, but the baby remained absorbed in its own quiet catalogue of suffering. Daniel felt something close to joy. At last, someone knew. Then Layla asked the question that froze whatever remained of his humanity. Have you been causing the problems? He hesitated, not because he was ashamed, because he realized the answer mattered. If he responded, she would know everything essential in one moment. He focused. The monitor tone dropped out for a single beat. Yes. Layla stared at the screen so long he thought she might stop breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Not fear alone, grief. What have you done? After that, Layla watched with the obsession of someone carrying a truth no framework exists to contain. She did not tell anyone immediately. Who would she tell, and how? Excuse me. I believe the ventilated post-operative patient with no meaningful motor response is conscious and is remotely manipulating medical equipment across the bay. Even the thought sounded absurd, so she watched, and what she saw over the next 2 nights stripped absurdity away. At 1:17, while she stood charting near the central desk, bed 3's pump alarmed for distal occlusion. When she moved toward it, Daniel's heart rate rose, despite no stimulation and no physiological reason. The moment she left his immediate vicinity, bed 4's monitor flashed a lead fault, then resolved before she arrived. Returning to Daniel, she saw his blood pressure trace settle into calm regularity, as if nothing had happened. At 2:43, a ventilator in the opposite corner triggered high-pressure alarms twice in rapid succession. Layla looked instinctively at Daniel before she looked at the machine. His oxygen saturation waveform jittered in a way she had started to recognize as the concentration. At 3:05, she stood at his bedside and said under her breath, "Stop." Every nearby alarm ceased. Not all the bay's sound, just the strange cascade that had begun to build. She felt cold all over. It was not a coincidence. It was not a haunted unit. It was a person, a trapped, conscious, furious person who had discovered that the only things listening to him were machines. Layla reviewed incident timings, cross-checked nursing notes, reread entries from nights when patients had inexplicably worsened. Once she saw the pattern, she could not unsee it. Instability clustered around Daniel's wakeful silence, like static around a live wire. And because she was a good nurse, because goodness was the very thing that made what came next unbearable, she also began to see the shape of his suffering, the delayed turns, the prolonged limbo, the conversations held over him, the staff assumptions that stable meant insensate, the tiny indignities, the suspended life. She understood enough to pity him and enough to fear him. By then, Daniel no longer needed anger to act. Practice had refined power into something almost elegant. He could influence one machine while anticipating another. He could pull staff across the bay like chess pieces, forcing them to choose between bed spaces. He could create enough uncertainty to make good clinicians doubt their own instincts. And with each success, his motives darkened. At first, he had envied the others for being loved, then for being seen. Later, he hated them for being recoverable. He listened to talk of tracheostomy plans, step-down possibilities, family hope, ceiling of care, discussions that still implied there was a self inside worth negotiating around. No one spoke that way about him anymore. He had become the fixed point around which the rest of the bay evolved, permanent, unresolved, monstrous. One night he nearly killed the motorcyclist in bed 3, a subtle sequence, Ventilator desynchrony, slightly delayed recognition of dropping tidal volumes, a pump interruption timed to coincide with the confusion, saturations falling, staff flooding in. Layla was there first and seemed to know, almost before anyone else, where to look. At Daniel. "Stop," she said through clenched teeth, as she corrected the ventilator settings at the other bed space. His own monitor screamed into tachycardia. The patient stabilized, but not before the whole unit had tipped into full emergency response. More staff, more noise, a consultant called from home, portable imaging, blood gases, documentation, the bay carrying the scorched metal smell of adrenaline and stress long after dawn. Daniel should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt something stranger, disappointment, because chaos was becoming normal, because it no longer restored his personhood, because even as he bent the room to his will, he remained trapped in the same unmoving body, hearing his own secretions, feeling the weight of the tube, sensing the slow degradation of flesh that could neither live properly nor die. Power had not freed him. It had only made him dangerous. The morning after the near-fatal event, Layla stood in the medication room with the door closed and tried to think like a professional. Patient safety, escalation, evidence, capacity, delirium, fatigue. Those were the words she reached for. They all failed. She considered telling the consultant she trusted most, then imagined his expression hardening into concern for her, not the situation. She considered documenting exactly what she had seen, but what language could survive scrutiny? She imagined reading it later in an inquest bundle and felt faint. She considered doing nothing. That option died the moment she heard Mr. Holloway's wife thanking staff for everything you're doing, while Daniel lay 3 meters away, listening. That evening Layla came in early and stood at bed 6 before handover. For the first time she did not speak kindly. Her voice was quiet, controlled, and shaking underneath. "I know you can hear me." His heart rate rose. "I know what you're doing." The arterial line flickered. She swallowed. "People are going to die." Beep. A deliberate pause. Then the monitor resumed. If he could have smiled, he would have. Layla saw it then. Not literally, not some expression crossing an immobile face, but the shape of intention behind the machine response. This was no longer only a victim lashing out blindly. There was will in it, choice, calculation, and yet she could not hate him cleanly because she also knew what had made him. The thought came into her mind so quietly she almost missed it. If he is still here, then keeping him alive is not neutral. It was not an idea a nurse should ever have about a patient in her care. It was also true. On her final break before dawn, Layla sat beside Daniel with the curtains half drawn and spoke to him as if confession could travel through circuitry. "I'm trying to understand," she said. The bay beyond the curtains breathed and beeped and muttered to itself. Someone coughed. A pump alarmed in the distance and was silenced. "You were failed," she said. "I know that. Maybe not by one person, maybe not by one obvious thing. But you were failed." His monitor steadied, almost listening. "You didn't deserve this." For a long moment, nothing changed. Then his heart rate slowed. A strange tenderness broke through her fear. She went on, "But they didn't deserve what you did either." Instantly, the rhythm sharpened. Faster, harder. The nearby infusion pump issued a warning tone for no reason she could see. Layla closed her eyes. "There you are," she whispered. That was the real horror, finally. Not the malfunctioning machines, not the impossible. Physiology of trapped consciousness, controlling equipment, but the ordinary recognizability of him, the human reflex of defensiveness, the inability to bear blame, The way suffering had not made him alien at all, only more terribly human. Maybe that was why she stayed, why she kept talking, because part of her wanted him to show remorse, wanted some sign that the man beneath the silence still existed separate from the thing the bay had made. Instead, as she sat there, bed 2's ventilator alarmed again, not loudly, not yet. A warning breath. Layla looked at Daniel. His heart rate was climbing. "Stop it!" The alarm escalated. She ran. By the time she reached Mr. Holloway's bed, oxygen saturation was dropping, and the wife, visiting late with special permission because the previous night had been so bad, had stood up in fright. Staff converged, and over the noise, over the movement, over the professional choreography of rescue, Layla understood with perfect clarity that Daniel had chosen his moment for maximum cruelty. He wanted her to hear him. He wanted her to know. He wanted witness. The final night began deceptively quietly. There was rain again, tapping faintly against windows no patient could see. The lights were dimmed. A locum registrar covered 2 areas and looked dangerously overextended. One nurse had gone home sick. Another bay had a fresh admission requiring endless interventions. Layla knew before midnight that the unit was vulnerable. Daniel knew too. She spent the first hours orbiting bed 6 with the vigilance of someone guarding a live explosive. Each time she moved away, something somewhere nudged toward disorder. A saturation probe dropped, a pump reset, a high-pressure alarm chirped, then vanished. Tiny feints, testing her reach. At 1:30, bed 4, the older woman who had been improving for days, developed sudden arrhythmia on the monitor. Layla saw it before anyone else and saw Daniel's blood pressure trace jitter at the exact same moment. "No," she said aloud. She lunged to bed 4, manually checked the pulse, realized the rhythm on screen did not match the physiology, and began disconnecting and rechecking leads before the false alarm could snowball into a full arrest call. Across the bay, another pump alarmed, then another. Too many things at once. He was escalating. The locum registrar entered, trying to triage which problem was real. Staff spread thin, curtains opening, lights brightening, voices hardening. Daniel drove the room like an orchestra. Monitor artifact became hypertension. Hypertension masked a ventilator fault. The ventilator fault distracted from a pump failure. Each interruption small enough to look plausible, together enough to destabilize the whole bay. For 10 minutes, the unit hovered on the brink of catastrophe. Then bed 3 desaturated hard, a genuine drop this time. The motorcyclist's chest ceased synchronizing with the ventilator. The waveform collapsed into nonsense. Someone shouted for airway help. Someone else called for the consultant. The father who had stayed overnight was ushered back in panic. Layla looked at Daniel. His heart rate was the highest she had ever seen it. His arterial waveform quivered with effort. Every machine near him seemed fractionally alive in the wrong way. This was not random mayhem. This was intent, without restraint. She crossed the bay and came to his bedside while the others fought to stabilize bed 3. "You're going to kill him." The monitor skipped a beat, then resumed. "Yes." There was no remorse left in him now, no hidden plea to be understood, only appetite for disruption and the bitter logic that if he could not leave, no one else should either. In that moment, Layla stopped looking for another solution. The decision did not arrive dramatically. No thunderclap, no noble music, no certainty. Just a narrowing. A professional life spent preserving life, colliding with the knowledge that life, in this one, grotesque circumstance, had become the mechanism of ongoing harm. Layla moved with outward calm because years in ICU had trained calm into her bones. Inside, she was breaking. She checked his observations. Stable enough, on paper. The absurdity of it nearly made her laugh. Daniel Mercer had never looked less like the source of violence than he did in that moment, motionless, ventilated, lined, monitored, sedated only by his own impossible condition. She leaned close so only he could hear. "I'm sorry," she whispered. His heart rate rose instantly. "You should have been heard." Higher still. "You should have been helped." The monitor gave a rapid, uneven burst. "But this can't carry on." Everything around his bed seemed to sharpen, every beep distinct, every hiss of the ventilator intimate, every blinking number a witness. Layla's hand hovered over the settings. Any outsider would later have described what happened in technical, bloodless terms if they knew of it at all. Ventilatory support altered, a chain of consequences, a body unable to sustain itself. But from Daniel's side of the silence, it felt like the first true physical panic since waking. The rhythm changed. The machine that had been breathing for him no longer breathed the same way. The air arriving in his chest altered, less certainty, less support. The invisible architecture keeping him tethered began to loosen. No. The scream inside him was enormous. No, 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 no. He hurled himself at every machine within reach. Monitors shrieked. A pump in the neighboring bed space faltered. Bed 4's screen flashed nonsense values. An infusion alarm pulsed at the desk. For one wild second, the bay seemed to buck under a final wave of his resistance. Layla did not stop. There were tears on her face now. She hated herself. She hated him. She hated whatever chain of ordinary failures had built this point from routine surgery and human trust. "I'm sorry," she said again, and this time it sounded like a prayer. Daniel fought with everything left of him, not because he wanted to live, not in any meaningful sense, not like this, because choice was being taken from him once more. Because even as a monster, he was still human enough to fear extinction. His heart raced, then stumbled. The monitor tone stretched. The frantic electrical weather around the bay began to collapse. Some staff glanced over, registering bed 6's deterioration as one more problem among many. A registrar called for help elsewhere. Someone said, "What's happening there?" But not with the urgency of a priority reshuffle. Daniel had been half abandoned for so long that even his dying entered the room as a lower-order event. And then, just as suddenly as terror had filled him, a strange clarity arrived. The machines were receding. Their hold on him, or his hold on them, was slipping. The room became very sharp. He heard the rain again. He heard Layla crying quietly beside him. He heard from somewhere farther away Mr. Holloway's wife saying, "Is he all right?" about someone else. He thought of the voice in theatre telling him to think of somewhere peaceful. He could not remember a beach. He could not remember anything peaceful at all. The tone became continuous. Silence in ICU is never total. There is always another patient, another machine, another breath assisted by plastic and power. But there was a local silence after Daniel died, a vacancy, a pressure released. Layla felt it first in the absence of resistance. The screens near bed 6 calmed. The inexplicable cascade of faults and artifacts simply stopped, as if a hand had lifted from the whole electrical skin of the bay. Bed 3 stabilized. Bed 4's rhythm normalized. The desk alarms fell quiet, one by one. The locum registrar, still unaware of the truth, looked around as though the unit itself had exhaled after a prolonged spasm. "Right," he said shakily. "Let's regroup." Regroup. The language of survival after crisis. Layla stepped back from Daniel's bed, feeling hollowed out. She knew what she had done, knew there was no ethical framework broad enough to hold it honestly. If anyone asked later, there would be observations, timing, deterioration, the plausible mess of critical care around an already complex patient. No one asked immediately. There were too many living patients requiring attention. She drew the curtain partly closed and stood for a moment with one hand on the rail. His face, the little of it visible around tape and tubing, was unchanged. No dramatic expression, no final revelation. Just a body finally still in a way it had never been while consciousness raged inside it. "You're gone," she whispered, unsure whether she wanted reassurance or absolution. Nothing answered. For the first time in days, Daniel Mercer did not hear. The bay had resumed its ordinary shape. One patient stepped down. Another required review for renal replacement therapy. A fresh handover erased the supernatural and replaced it with chronology. Bed 6 died overnight. Deterioration on background of prolonged failure to regain consciousness. Family informed. Further details to follow. Clean phrases, contained phrases. A porter came later with a bed from another area. The unit never tolerated emptiness for long. The new patient was a woman in her 40s, post-emergency laparotomy, sedated, ventilated, hemodynamically fragile, but salvageable. Staff prepared the space with the brisk competence that follows all endings in hospitals. New tubing, new labels, new syringes, new chart. Fresh lines of ownership drawn over old suffering. Layla worked the shift in a state beyond fatigue. Twice she nearly told someone everything. Twice she imagined the words and remained silent. By late afternoon, relatives filled the bay again. Mr. Holloway's wife spoke to her husband about going home. Bed 4's daughter brought clean pajamas in optimistic anticipation. Life, indecently, pressed forward. As the new patient in bed 6 settled, a junior nurse adjusted the monitor leads and frowned. "That's odd." Layla looked up sharply. "What?" "Nothing. Just a trace issue." The waveform on the screen gave a small, irregular shiver, then steadied. Layla stood very still. No. Impossible. Overtired mind. Pattern seeking after trauma. She forced herself back to task. An hour later, while charting at the desk, she heard it. A rhythm, not abnormal enough for anyone else to notice, just a subtle spacing in the monitor tone from bed 6. Beep, pause, beep, beep. Her blood turned to ice. She walked to the bedside without hurrying. The patient lay motionless, sedated, pupils taped for corneal protection, ventilator cycling smoothly. Layla stared at the monitor. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the arterial trace jumped once. Deliberate, impossible, familiar. The room seemed to tilt, not transferred exactly. Not a soul moving from body to body in some childish horror film sense. Something worse, a pattern, a persistence. Consciousness smeared through circuitry and proximity and repeated enough times to leave a residue. Or perhaps Daniel had never needed the body as much as she had believed. Perhaps the body had only been the door. Layla took one involuntary step back. No one else noticed. Across the bay, a relative laughed at something trivial and loving. A registrar discussed antibiotics. A pump clicked. Rain began again outside. And from bed 6, hidden in the harmless music of the monitor, came the smallest possible answer to her terror. Still here. If anyone had opened the electronic record weeks later, they would have found an orderly account. Elective surgery, unexpected failure to regain consciousness, prolonged ICU admission, episodes of unexplained instability in surrounding patients, investigated as equipment and acuity-related issues, overnight deterioration, death. No mention of the screams no one heard. No mention of the hatred grown from neglect. No mention of a nurse standing beside a bed deciding that mercy and murder had become impossible to distinguish. Hospitals are good at recording what can be measured. They are less good at recording what lingers. Layla never worked another night in that bay without listening too carefully to the monitors. She never again heard a simple alarm as a simple alarm. Every irregularity acquired a second meaning. Every unexplained pause made her stomach turn. And sometimes in the hour before dawn, when intensive care becomes most unreal, when the fluorescent light fades into the blue-grey of approaching morning and staff move through, exhaustion, like divers in deep water, she would hear a sequence of tones from one bed space or another that no one else seemed to register. Not enough to alarm, not enough to prove, just enough to remind. That somewhere between consciousness and machinery, between helplessness and rage, something had learned how to survive. The case ended, as most cases do, on paper, but not in the unit, not in the wires, not in the listening dark.